Stryker made a padding turn around the control room, tugging unhappily at the scanty fringe of hair the years had left him. If they're neither Hymenops nor resurgent colonists, he said, then there's only one choice remaining. They're aliens from a system we haven't reached yet, beyond the old sphere of Terran exploration. We always assumed that we'd find other races out here someday, and that they'd be as different from us in form and motivation as the Hymenops. Why not now? Gibson said seriously, "Not probably. The same objection that rules out the bees applies to any trans-Alphardian culture. They'd have to be beyond the atomic fission stage, else they'd never have attempted interstellar flight. The ringwave, with its zero-interval transfer principle and instantaneous communications applications, is the only answer to long-range travel. And if they'd had that, they wouldn't have bothered with atomics." Stryker turned on him almost angrily. "Well, if they're not Hymenops, or humans, or aliens, then what in God's name are they?" "Aye, there's the rub," Farrell said, quoting a passage whose aptness had somehow seen it through a dozen reorganizations of insular tongue and a final translation to Universal Terran. "If they're none of those three, we've only one conclusion left. There's no one down there at all. We're victims of the first joint hallucination in psychiatric history." Stryker threw up his hands in surrender. "We can't identify them by theorizing. And that brings us down to the business of first-hand investigation. Who's going to bell the cat this time?" "I'd like to go," Gibson said at once. "The ZIT computer can wait." Stryker vetoed his offer as promptly. "No, the ZIT comes first. We may have to run for it, and we can't set up a transfer jump without the computer. It's got to be me or Arthur." Farrell felt the familiar chill of uneasiness that inevitably preceded this moment of decision. He was not lacking in courage, else the circumstances under which he had worked for the past 10 years, the sometimes perilous, sometimes downright charnel conditions left by the fleeting Hymenop conquerors, would have broken him long ago. But that same hard experience had honed rather than blunted the edge of his imagination, and the prospect of a close-quarter stalking of an unknown and patently hostile force was anything but attractive. "Well, you two did the field work on the last location," he said. "It's high time I took my turn. God knows I'd go mad if I had to stay in ship and listen to Lee memorizing his handbook subsections, or to Gibb practicing dead languages with Xavier." Stryker laughed for the first time since the explosion that had so nearly wrecked the Marco IV. "Good enough, though it wouldn't be more diverting to listen for hours to you improvising inharmonic variations on the Lament for Old Terra with your accordion." Gibson characteristically had a refinement to offer. "They'll be alerted down there for a reconnaissance sally," he said. "Why not let Xavier take the scouter down for overt diversion and drop Arthur off in the helihopper for a low-level check?" Stryker looked at Farrell. "All right, Arthur?" "Good enough," Farrell said. And to Xavier, who had not moved from his post at the magno-scanner, "How does it look, Xav? Have you pinned down their base yet?" The mechanical answered him in a voice as smooth and clear, and as inflectionless, as a cello note. "The planet seems uninhabited except for a large island some 300 miles in diameter. There are 27 small agrarian hamlets surrounded by cultivated fields. There is one city of perhaps 1,000 buildings with a central square. In the square rests a grounded spaceship of approximately 10 times the bulk of the Marco IV." They crowded about the vision screen, jostling Xavier's jointed gray shape in their interest. The central city lay in minutest detail before them, the battered hulk of the grounded ship glinting rustily in the late afternoon sunlight. Streets radiated away from the square in orderly succession, the whole so clearly depicted that they could see the throngs of people surging up and down, tiny, foreshortened faces turned toward the sky. At least they're human, Farrell said. Relief replaced in some measure his earlier uneasiness. Which means that they're Terran, and can be dealt with according to Reclamation's routine. Is that Hulk space-worthy, Xav? Xavier's mellow drone assumed the convention vibrato that indicated stark puzzlement. Its breached hull makes the ship incapable of flight. Apparently it is used only to supply power to the outlying hamlets. The mechanical put a flexible gray finger upon an indicator graph derived from a composite section of detector meters. The power transmitted seems to be gross electric current conveyed by metallic cables. It is generated through a crudely governed process of continuous atomic fission. Farrell, himself appalled by the information, still found himself able to chuckle at Stryker's bellow of consternation. Continuous fission? Good God, only madmen would deliberately run a risk like that. Farrell prodded him with cheerful malice. Why say madmen? Maybe they're humanoid aliens who thrive on hard radiation and look on the danger of being blown to hell in the middle of the night as a satisfactory risk. They're not alien, Gibson said positively. Their architecture is Terran, and so is their ship. The ship is incredibly primitive, though. Those batteries of tubes at either end are thrust reaction jets, Stryker finished in an awed voice. Primitive isn't the word, Gib. The thing is prehistoric. Rocket propulsion hasn't been used in spacecraft since... How long, Xav? Xavier supplied the information with mechanical infallibility. Since the year 2100, when the ringwave propulsion communication principle was discovered. That principle has served men since. Farrell stared in blank disbelief at the anomalous craft on the screen. Primitive, as Stryker had said, was not the word for it. Clumsily ovoid, studded with torpedo domes and turrets and bristling at either end with propulsion tubes, it lay at the center of its square like a rusted relic of a past largely destroyed and all but forgotten. What a magnificent disregard its builders must have had, he thought, for their lives and the genetic purity of their posterity. The sullen atomic fires banked in that oxidizing hulk. Stryker said plaintively, If you're right, Gib, then we're more in the dark than ever. How could a Terran-built ship 1,100 years old get here? Gibson, absorbed in his chess player's contemplation of alternatives, seemed hardly to hear him. Logic or not logic, Gibson said. If it's a Terran artifact, we can discover the reason for its presence. If not, any problem posed by one group of human beings, Stryker quoted his handbook, can be resolved by any other group, regardless of ideology or conditioning, because the basic perceptive abilities of both must be the same through identical heredity. If it's an imitation, and this is another Hymenop experiment in condition ecology, then we're stumped to begin with, Gibson finished, because we're not equipped to evaluate the psychology of alien motivation. We've got to determine first which case applies here. He waited for Farrell's expected irony, and when the navigator forestalled him by remaining grimly quiet, continued, The obvious premise is that a Terran ship must have been built by Terrans. Question, was it flown here or built here? Couldn't have been built here, Stryker said. Alphard 6 was surveyed just before the Bees took over in 3025, and there was nothing of the sort here then. It couldn't have been built during the 2¼ centuries since. It's obviously much older than that. It was flown here. Well, we progress, Farrell said dryly. Now, if you'll tell us how, we're ready to move.